I stared at the stainless steel trash can, the echo of my phone hitting the bottom ringing louder than my own heartbeat. "You don't need to talk to anyone," my daughter had said, her voice flat with authority, as if cutting me off from the world was an act of kindness. For a moment, I almost but the day that call finally came, I realized the silence she forced on me wasn't protection, it was betrayal. Wait, before we go any further, I gotta ask, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. The argument wasn't loud. It never was in this house. Control didn't need raised voices, only small, deliberate gesture. Janet Miller sat at the kitchen table, flipping slowly through the newspaper she had already read twice that morning, when Laura's hand suddenly darted across the counter. Without even glancing at her mother, Laura scooped up Janet's cell phone. "This thing is nothing but a nuisance," Laura muttered, the disdain in her voice disguised as practicality. Janet opened her mouth to protest, but before the words could form, she watched Laura stride to the stainless steel trash can, lift the lid, and drop the phone inside with a hollow clunk. The sound reverberated through Janet's chest. Ethan chuckled from the recliner in the adjoining living room, his laugh sharp and careless. "Well, that saves us money on the bill, huh? One less gadget to keep charged." He shook the remote control in his hand as if it were some kind of prize. Janet's lips pressed together. She forced her eyes back down to the newspaper as though she were studying the ink, but the words blurred into meaningless black smudges. The kitchen smelled faintly of burned coffee. A fly buzzed lazily against the. Sophie lingered in the doorway, backpack slung over her shoulder, ready to leave for her part-time shift at the coffee shop. Her brown eyes darted from her mother to her grandmother, then back again. She adjusted the strap on her shoulder, chewing on the inside of her cheek, but said nothing. Silence was safer. Janet lifted her cup of lukewarm coffee and sipped, careful not to let her hand tremble. "It's fine," she murmured, though no one asked. Laura was already scrolling through her own phone, tapping quick and decisive with her manicured nail. Ethan turned back to the muted football, the flash of the screen reflecting off his glasses. The moment passed for them, but not for Janet. Hours later, when the house had emptied, Ethan gone to meet a buddy, Laura off to run errands, Sophie tucked away at her job, Janet moved quietly through the stillness. Afternoon light filtered in through the blinds, striping the kitchen floor in pale gold. She knelt beside the trash can. The lid creaked as she lifted it, and the stale odor of coffee grounds and damp paper towels wafted her stomach. Digging past discarded junk mail and yesterday's cereal boxes, her fingers brushed against the familiar cool rectangle. She pulled the phone free, its screen spiderwebbed with cracks, battery cover askew. Janet sat back on her heels, cradling the broken device in her palm as though it were fragile life. "Not so useless after all," she whispered to the quiet kid. That night, under the hum of the single lamp in her bedroom, Janet cleaned the phone with tissues and a cotton cloth. Her reflection in the fractured glass looked older, wearier, but her eyes were clear, focused. She wrapped the device in a handkerchief and slipped it into her purse. The next morning, she pushed open the narrow glass door of a small repair shop on East Washington Avenue. A bell jingled overhead, releasing the faint scent of solder and plastic. Behind the counter, David Cho looked up from a disassembled laptop. He wore a patient expression, the kind of face that suggested nothing in technology or people could surprise him for long. "Morning," Janet said, her voice low but steady. She placed the wrapped bundle on the counter, unwrapping it carefully as if revealing a secret. David examined the phone, turning it gently in his hand. "Took a hit, but the board looks intact. I should be able to pull the data." A slow breath escaped her lungs, relief mixed with something sharper, something like determination. "I'll need a little time," David added, already reaching for his tool. "But yes, there's a good chance I can recover what's on here." Janet leaned in slightly, her fingers gripping the edge of the counter. "That's all I need. The data." David glanced up, reading something in her, but didn't press. Janet's hand brushed over the cracked phone one last time before letting go. She straightened her shoulders, voice barely above a whisper but steady as bedrock. "They want silence. I'll find a." The shop was quiet except for the faint whir of a desktop fan and the occasional click of David Cho's tool. Janet stood beside the counter, her purse clutched tight against her ribs, eyes fixed on the fractured phone that now glowed faintly under his care. "There," David murmured, leaning closer. The screen sputtered, lines of static fuzzing across before stabilizing into a dim but readable display. "We've got life." Janet exhaled as though she'd been holding her breath for hours. David connected the phone to a tangle of cables that fed into his workstation. Icons populated slowly, sluggish from the damage. Then a red bubble appeared in the corner of the voicemail app. One unheard message, David noted. He angled the screen toward her. Want to play it? Janet nodded, her throat tight. The speaker crackled, and a crisp professional voice filled the cramped shop. Mrs. Miller, this is Diane from Ward and Associate. We've been trying to reach you about some estate documents that require your presence. Please call us back at your earliest convenience. The message ended with a polite beep, leaving a silence that felt far heavier than the words themselves. Janet's hand hovered over the counter, trembling slightly. Estate doc. The phrase settled like a weight in her chest, both foreign and familiar. She forced herself upright, hiding the shake in her. How recent? She asked. David tapped a few keys, eyes flicking across the recovered metadata. Last week. Her mouth went dry. I never heard a single ring. He hesitated, then clicked into the call log. Rows of entries scrolled upward, and a frown tugged at his brow. Huh. Looks like certain numbers have been consistently blocked. This one in particular. He tapped the lawyer's number. Called several times. Always silence. Janet's lips parted, disbelief washing over her. Blocked? I didn't block it. Phone records don't lie, David said gently. If you'd like, I can print the logs. Could be useful if there's a dispute. His eyes lingered on her just long enough to suggest he suspected there was more here than she had admitted. Janet steadied her breath, meeting his gaze. Yes, print everything. The small printer in the corner hummed, spitting out page after page of evidence, dates, times, numbers. Janet gathered them carefully, sliding each sheet into a folder she'd tucked into her purse. Her fingers smoothed the paper as though it were fragile fabric, terrified it might crumble if she didn't treat it with reverence. When she returned home, the house was still. The late afternoon sun glowed faintly against the blind, dust motes swirling in the air. She carried the folder upstairs like contraband, settling at the edge of her bed with the phone cradled in her lap. The door creaked, and Sophie slipped in quietly, shutting it behind her. Grandma? She whispered. Janet startled, then softened when she saw her granddaughter's anxious expression. Sophie's hair was pulled back in a messy bun, her work apron still tied at her waist. I heard you went to that repair place, Sophie said cautiously. Her voice trembled just enough to betray the risk she felt even speaking the words. Did they get anything back? Janet hesitated, searching her granddaughter's eyes. She saw the conflict there, the tug of loyalty against fear. They did, Janet admitted, her voice low. A message from a lawyer's office about documents I was. Sophie bit her lip, glanced toward the door, then leaned. They don't want you to know, she whispered, almost too softly to hear. The words pierced deeper than any cruelty Laura had spoken aloud. Sophie's voice carried truth, raw and unvarnished. Janet's pulse quickened. She slid the printed logs from her folder, pressing them flat on the quilt. Columns of dates and blocked calls stared back at her, undeniable, cold. Her jaw tightened. She felt the years of being dismissed, patronized, ignored by the people she trusted, building like sediment at the bottom of a river. But instead of weighing her down, it gave her a strange, sharpened. She folded the pages back into the folder and snapped it shut with finality. Then I'll find out what else they don't want me to know. The downtown office was quiet, the kind of silence padded by thick carpet and heavy binders lining every shelf. Janet stepped in, clutching her folder like armor. The air smelled faintly of leather and copier tone, a sterile contrast to the storm that had been brewing in her chest since she heard the voicemail. At the reception desk, a woman in a navy blazer glanced up. Mrs. Miller? Yes, Janet said, her voice steady but cautious. Diane, we spoke on the phone. The woman smiled kindly, gesturing toward a narrow hallway. Come with me. Ms. Ward wants to meet you herself. Janet followed, the click of Diane's heels echoing against the muted space. They entered a conference room lined with glass-fronted bookcases, where a tall woman with sharp eyes and silver hair sat at the head of a long oak table. Mrs. Miller. The woman rose, extending her hand. Rachel Ward, please, sit. Janet lowered herself into the chair, setting her folder on the. Her fingers brushed across the wood grain, grounding her. Rachel slid a thick file across the. Your late husband left more than the initial will indicate. He added an amendment, a codicil, naming you primary heir to the estate. That includes the house, accounts, and residual asset. Janet's breath caught. She blinked at the papers, vision momentarily blurring. He never told me. Rachel's tone softened. Sometimes people hold back until they're certain, But that isn't the issue. She opened another folder and pushed it closer. Your daughter and her husband filed a petition last month, claiming you're no longer competent to handle your affairs. They've requested guardianship over both you and your assets. The words hit harder than Laura's contempt ever had. Janet stared at the pages, black type leaping from the white paper like accusation, incompetent, incapable. Words meant to strip her of agency. She steadied her hand as she flipped to the signature page and froze. The scrawl at the bottom, jagged and uneven, was a cruel imitation of her own. Rachel's voice cut through the stillness. We compared these to verified documents you signed last year. The handwriting doesn't match. A cold anger slid into Janet's veins. She leaned closer, studying every curve, every false letter. Her daughter had not only silenced her, she had tried to erase her entirely. Rachel closed the folder with a firm hand. If you want to fight this, you'll need counsel. I'll represent you, but you must be prepared for a battle. They won't stop easily. Janet looked up, meeting Rachel's unwavering gaze. For the first time in weeks, she felt someone in the room wasn't under Laura's spell. I want every document, Janet said, her voice steady, firm. Copies of all of it. I'll study every word. Rachel nodded. Diane will make you a full set. While the assistant moved to the copier, Janet sat in the quiet, tracing the grain of the table with her fingertip. Each whir and snap of the machine down the hall felt like a nail in the coffin of Laura's deception. When Diane returned, she placed a heavy stack in front of Janet, neatly clipped and tabbed. Janet slid the papers into her folder with careful precision, the weight grounding her. She rose slowly, thanking both women with a nod. Rachel touched her arm lightly before she left. You're stronger than they realize. Don't forget. Outside, the September air was cool against her cheeks. She paused on the courthouse steps, folder pressed to her chest, the city sounds around her muffled by the rush of her own pulse. For years, she had been careful, quiet, measured. Today, something shifted. The words Laura had written, incompetent, echoed in her mind, but instead of breaking her, they solidified her resolve. She drew a breath, her whisper carried away by the breeze. They underestimated my. The kitchen smelled of lemon cleaner, sharp and artificial, as Laura spread a stack of envelopes across the counter like a dealer loan card. Janet entered quietly, the folder from the lawyer's office tucked beneath her arm. Laura glanced up, her expression already fixed in a mask of practiced Mom, I've been meaning to talk to you. These documents, they're complicated. Too complicated for you to manage on your own. Her tone wasn't sharp. It was the kind of smooth condescension Janet knew all too well, the same voice Laura used with telemarketers or bank tellers she wanted to dismiss. Ethan sat at the table, leaning back in his chair, arms crossed. He didn't add a word, but his approving nod was enough. The weight of his silent agreement pressed as heavy as Laura's voice. Janet set her folder down on the far edge of the counter, careful not to reveal its content. She smoothed the sleeve of her cardigan, her face an unreadable mask. I've managed paperwork my whole life, she said mildly. Nursing charts, patient files, end-of-life directive. None of it killed me. Laura's eyes narrowed. This is different. Legal terms, estate transfers, things you could easily misunderstand. From the hallway, a faint creak of floorboards betrayed Sophie's presence. Janet didn't look toward her granddaughter, but she felt it. The prickling awareness of being watched. Sophie lingered just out of sight, listening. Janet clasped her hands calmly on the counter. She didn't argue, didn't rise to the bait. The silence stretched, forcing Laura to fill it. You don't want to make mistakes, Mom. That's why Ethan and I are stepping in. We're just trying to protect you. Ethan nodded again, lips pressed in a thin line. Janet only inclined her head slightly, as if acknowledging a point she neither accepted nor denied. She could feel Sophie's presence retreating down the hall, the soft shuffle of socks on wood. The conversation fizzled there, Laura growing impatient with Janet's lack of protest. She gathered the envelopes into a neat pile, muttering about appointments and deadlines as she carried them to her room. Ethan trailed after her, leaving the kitchen in a hush. Janet lifted her folder from the counter and carried it upstairs. The house was darker now, evening shadows creeping across the walls. She settled onto the edge of her bed, opening the folder to review the copies Rachel had given her. The neat rows of text felt like quiet allies, evidence Laura couldn't erase. The door eased open with the softest. Sophie slipped inside, closing it behind her with careful hand. Her eyes were wide, her cheeks flushed with the weight of what she'd just heard. Grandma, she whispered, crossing the room in a few quick steps. I heard them. I heard what Mom said. Janet reached out, resting a hand on her granddaughter's arm. I know, sweetheart. Sophie shook her head fiercely, voice low but urgent. She's lying to you. She's trying to take everything. I don't care what she says. I'll help you. The words cracked something open in Janet's chest. For so long she had stood alone in the quiet of this house, bearing Laura's control in silence. Now, Sophie's whispered loyalty felt like sunlight breaking through a storm. Janet pulled her granddaughter into an embrace, her arms tightening around the trembling shoulders. Sophie clung back, burying her face into Janet's cardigan. I'll help you, Sophie repeated, muffled but fierce. Janet closed her eyes, inhaling the faint scent of coffee grounds and laundry detergent clinging to Sophie's. She pressed her cheek against the top of her granddaughter's head and whispered into the stillness of the room, a promise to herself as much as to the girl she held. They don't know what we're capable of. The Dane County Sheriff's Office was nothing like the hushed law firm. Its lobby hummed with fluorescent lights and the murmur of dispatch radios from deeper within the building. Janet sat stiff-backed in a molded plastic chair, Sophie beside her, the folder balanced carefully across. She had never imagined herself here, not as a victim, not as someone reporting her own. A door opened and a woman in a gray suit stepped into the lobby. Her stride was steady, her presence commanding but not in. Mrs. Miller? I'm Detective K. Janet rose, feeling Sophie's small squeeze on her hand. Holt ushered them into a private office. The walls bore framed commendation, and a corkboard displayed snapshots of missing checks, case notes, and family. Holt motioned for them to sit across from her desk. First, let me reassure you, Holt said evenly, folding her hand. You did the right thing by coming in. Elder exploitation is taken seriously. The phrase stung Janet's ears. Exploitation, such a clinical word for something that cut so personal. I'm not sure how far this has gone, Janet admitted, sliding the folder onto the desk. But there are documents, forged signatures, calls I was never allowed to receive. Holt opened the folder, flipping through the neatly tabbed copies. Her eyes sharpened as she scanned the petition Laura and Ethan had filed. This lines up with what we received last week, Holt said, glancing up. Janet blinked. What you received? A third party already filed a financial exploitation report in your name. That's why your case landed on my desk. Janet sat back, stunned. Someone else? Who? Holt shook her head gently. Confidential. But the report alleged attempts to redirect your Social Security payment. She tapped a page in the folder. And based on what I'm seeing here, that claim has weight. The routing numbers were changed. Your benefits nearly funneled into a joint account under your daughter's name. The room seemed to tilt. Janet gripped the arm of her. Laura. The name left her mouth like broken glass. Holt continued, matter of fact. There's more. We traced withdrawals linked to forged authorization. They tie back to your son-in-law, Ethan Miller. Gambling debts mostly. It's not just poor judgment, it's fraud. Janet's pulse hammered in her, but her face remained. She had learned long ago as a nurse to keep her expression calm even when chaos exploded around her. Beside her, Sophie's fists clenched in her lap. I have proof, she blurted. Text from Mom and Dad about Grandma's money. Both adults turned to her. Sophie fumbled with her phone, scrolling furiously before handing it to Holt. The detective read silently. Make sure Grandma doesn't see the mail. We need those checks before she messes things. Ethan's handling it. Don't worry. She's clueless. Holt set the phone down with her expression unreadable but eyes fierce. Thank you, Sophie. This is exactly the kind of corroboration that holds up in court. Janet swallowed hard. Court? This isn't family tension, Mrs. Miller. Holt's voice carried no hesitation. It's crime, forgery, fraud, financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult. If we move forward, it won't be a quiet family matter anymore. It'll be the state versus your daughter and son-in-law. The words settled in the room like thunder. Sophie's breath hitched. Janet stared at the folder on the desk, at the careful tabs she'd assembled, at her late husband's handwriting still echoing through those pages. She felt something click into place. Fear gave way to clarity. Janet leaned forward, her voice no louder than a whisper, but every syllable sharp as a blade. Then let's treat it like one. The marble corridor of the Dane County Courthouse echoed with footsteps and muted but Janet felt cocooned in her own silence. She sat at the end of the long wooden bench, hands folded neatly over her lap, the folder resting beside her like a loyal companion. Sophie sat close, whispering encouragement, but Janet's eyes remained fixed on the heavy oak doors ahead. Inside, Judge Henry Collins presided over the probate courtroom, his reputation for blunt efficiency preceding him. When the clerk called the case, in re-guardianship of Janet Miller, Janet rose with quiet dignity and stepped forward. Laura was already there, standing tall in a navy blazer that sharpened her features. Ethan trailed behind, his tie slightly askew, his eyes restless. Your Honor, Laura began as soon as she was sworn in, her voice butter-smooth. We're here today because my mother has become increasingly confused. She forgets conversations, misplaces important items, and has shown poor judgment in handling her finances. My husband and I filed for guardianship to protect her interests. She glanced toward Janet with feigned concern, the kind of look a stranger might mistake for compassion. Janet didn't. She let the words settle, knowing silence could be more powerful than protest. Rachel Ward stood next, immaculate in a dark suit, her tone measured but cutting. Your Honor, I represent Mrs. Miller. We reject the characterization that she is incompetent. What my client suffers from is not confusion, but deliberate obstruction from her own daughter. The judge's eyes flicked toward Rachel. Rachel produced a crisp sheet from her binder. First, a statement from Dr. Lewis, Mrs. Miller's physician. He attests that she is fully capable of managing her affairs. No dementia, no impairment. His assessment is clear. She handed the note to the clerk, who passed it to Judge Collin. He scanned the page briefly, expression unreadable. Laura shifted in her chair. With respect, a doctor only sees her for a few minutes at a time. He doesn't see the day-to-day lapses. Rachel didn't raise her voice, but her interruption was precise. What he did see was no evidence of incapacity. What we do have evidence of, however, is a deliberate attempt to divert Mrs. Miller's Social Security benefit. Detective Holt rose from her seat in the gallery and stepped forward, sworn in swiftly. Her testimony was calm, factual, and devastating. She described the redirected payments, the forged withdrawals tied to Ethan, the text messages Sophie had provided. The air in the courtroom thickened with each word. Laura's mask slipped just enough to reveal the tension tightening around her mouth. Ethan, seated beside her, clenched his jaw so hard his temple. Judge Collins leaned back in his chair, fingers. Mrs. Miller's daughter files for guardianship, claiming her mother is incapable. Meanwhile, there is credible evidence that the same daughter sought financial control for personal benefit. That does not reflect well. Laura's protest came fast, brittle. This is a misunderstanding. We were only trying to… Enough! Collins's voice cut like a gavel itself. I'll determine intent based on evidence, not excuses. The gavel struck once, a sound that reverberated through Janet's bone. She sat still, her posture straight, hands folded. Her heart thundered, but outwardly she was calm, steady, unbreakable. The courtroom lights glinted off the rim of her glasses as she lifted her chin, her silence speaking louder than Laura's frantic words. Across the aisle, Ethan's glare landed on, dark, simmering, the look of a man cornered. For the first time, she didn't avert her gaze. She met it with quiet. The hearing adjourned for the day, but as the clerk announced recess, Janet gathered her papers slowly, deliberately. Around her, voices buzzed with speculation, but she heard only the echo of Holt's testimony and the crack of the gavel. Her whisper was meant only for herself, steady as a vow. This is only the beginning. The conference room at Ward & Associates felt colder than it had the week before. Papers covered the long oak table, spread into color-coded stacks that looked less like paperwork and more like a battlefield map. Janet sat at the far end, her cardigan buttoned to her throat, pen poised over a yellow legal pad. She had once charted vitals through double shifts and midnight emergencies. This wasn't so different. These numbers, too, told a story, one that could save her. Rachel Ward stood at the head of the table reading from a thick binder. The forensic accountant has finished his preliminary audit. She looked directly at Janet. It's worse than we thought. Detective Holt leaned against the wall, arms crossed, listening intently. Sophie sat beside Janet, eyes wide, her hand trembling as she twisted the strap of her backpack. Rachel slid the first stack across the table. Ethan Miller lost nearly $40,000 in online gambling. Withdrawals were masked through small, repeated transactions, often tied to accounts opened in your name. Janet's pen moved steadily across the pad. $40,000. Online. My name. Her stomach twisted, but her hand was calm. Rachel continued, her tone clinical. In addition, Laura Miller is connected to multiple credit card applications submitted fraudulently. Several accounts were opened using your Social Security number. Charges include retail purchases, luxury items, and travel expenses. Sophie gasped softly, clapping a hand to her mouth. Her eyes shimmered with tears. They used Grandma's credit for vacations? Her voice broke halfway through, but she forced herself upright. I should have known. I saw new bags, clothes, things she never explained. Rachel's gaze softened toward the girl. You couldn't have known the extent, Sophie. What matters now is we have proof. Holt stepped forward, flipping one of the pages toward Janet. Her finger traced down the column of numbers. Every transaction links back to their IP address, their devices. The timeline is airtight. The state prosecutor will have no trouble with this. Janet wrote again, the scratch of her pen steady. IP address. Timeline airtight. Sophie wiped her cheeks with the back of her sleeve, her voice small but fierce. I don't care if they're my parents. I'll tell them what I saw. Janet set her pen down, turning to Sophie. She touched her granddaughter's hand, her own lined fingers cool against Sophie's flushed one. You're braver than you know, she murmured. Rachel began compiling sheets into chronological order, binder clips snapping shut with decisive clicks. We'll build a timeline of theft. When it started, how it escalated, where the money went. Each charge will form a brick in the... Holt nodded, her voice low but firm. This isn't about perception. This is financial evidence. No jury can ignore it. The room quieted except for the shuffle of... Outside the tall windows, autumn leaves clung stubbornly to their branches, rustling against the glass. Janet picked up her pen again, her eyes narrowing as she studied the columns of numbers. She circled dates, drew lines between transactions, marked totals with neat underlines. To anyone else, the columns might blur into chaos, but Janet had lived her life in charts and decimals, in vital signs that could never be ignored. She saw patterns of habits, compulsion, desperation carved into every withdrawal. Her notes filled the pad with precision. No emotion, no just truth, recorded line by line. Rachel glanced at her, surprised. You understand these quickly. Janet gave a faint smile, the kind that didn't reach her eyes. Numbers don't lie. They never have. Silence stretched, heavy but resolute. Sophie leaned into her grandmother's shoulder, her tears drying into a new determination. Holt and Rachel exchanged a look. Respect, calculation, shared resolve. Janet closed her pad with deliberate care. She whispered to her, a vow sealed in ink and memory. They taught me numbers. I remember them all. The Miller kitchen, usually sterile with lemon polish and neat counter, was storming with Laura's fury. She slammed a drawer shut so hard a spoon rattled out onto the tile. You think you can drag my name through the mud? Laura's voice cracked sharp and shrill. After everything I've done for you? This house, this roof over your head, none of it would hold up without me. Janet stood by the sink, drying her hands on a dish towel as though her daughter's tirade were no more than a summer thunderstorm. Her face was composed, her voice absent, her silence deliberate. Sophie sat at the table, head bowed, phone hidden in her lap. Her thumb tapped lightly against the recording. Every barb, every accusation, every word, Laura. Ethan leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, his jaw tight, but his eyes restless. He let Laura carry the fight, but the way he chewed his lip betrayed unease. Laura's fury swelled, her gestures sharp enough to cut the air. Don't think your lawyer friend will save you. You can't even balance a checkbook without help. You'll embarrass yourself in court. Janet folded the towel neatly on the counter, turned slowly, and met her daughter's blazing eyes. She didn't argue, didn't protest. She simply looked at her, long enough, steady enough, that Laura faltered mid-sentence, her words hanging heavy. The silence pressed in until Sophie cleared her throat softly. Maybe you should stop yelling. Laura spun on her. Don't you dare take her side. But Sophie's phone had already captured the snarl, every jagged note of venom preserved in digital clarity. Later that evening, in Rachel Ward's office, Sophie slid the phone across the table. I got all of it, she whispered. Rachel played the audio, the room filling with Laura's tirade, the venom impossible to reinterpret as... When the clip ended, Rachel looked at Sophie with quiet pride. This is strong evidence, not just hostility, proof of coercion. Detective Holt, seated across from him, nodded once. It's enough to justify immediate protective measures. She pulled a form from her folder and began writing, her pen moving swiftly. We'll file for a temporary restraining order. It will limit Laura's access until the trial proceeds. Janet listened, her hands folded on her lap. A flicker of relief warmed her chest, but she remained still, composed. Will it protect Sophie, too? Yes, Holt said firmly. Both of you. The following morning, the order was served. Laura erupted in the front yard, her shrieks echoing down the block, neighbors pausing in their driveway. Ethan hovered behind her, face pale, his movements twitchy. When the officer handed him his own set of documents, charges noted, hearings scheduled, his composure cracked. He muttered curses under his breath, his hands restless against his thighs. Inside the house, Janet sat at the kitchen table, a mug of tea before her, Sophie beside her like a shadow. Through the window they watched Ethan pacing, Laura gesticulating wildly. Sophie glanced nervously at her grandmother. "Aren't you scared?" Janet lifted her mug, blowing on the steam, her voice soft but steady. "Silence isn't safety. I know that now." The words hung between them, stronger than any raised voice, stronger than Laura's chaos outside. Sophie reached for her hand, squeezing tight. Janet returned the squeeze, her calm no longer fragile but forged, tempered in fire. The storm outside raged, but inside the kitchen, a different kind of strength was taking root. And for the first time in years, Janet felt the balance tilting, not toward her daughter's control, but toward her own quiet power. The paper landed with a solid thunk against the front porch, still damp with morning. Sophie retrieved it, her hands trembling as she unfolded the front page. Across the top, bold black letters screamed, "Local woman fights daughter's alleged exploitation in probate court." Beneath it, a photo, Janet stepping out of the courthouse, folder in her arms, Sophie at her side. The image caught her mid-stride, head high, jaw set, the very picture of quiet resilience. "Grandma," Sophie's voice cracked as she slid the paper across the kitchen table. "You're on the front page." Janet adjusted her glasses, studying the photo for a long moment. The article stretched below, recounting accusations of forged withdrawals, blocked phone calls, redirected Social Security payments. The words were matter of fact, stripped of family excuses. Neighbors read it, church friends read it, Laura would read it. The silence in the kitchen felt different, not imposed, not heavy, but brimming with change. By mid-morning, the phone rang. This time, Janet answered. "Janet, it's Marjorie from down the street," a familiar voice chirped. "I just saw the article. I want you to know, we believe you. If you need anything, anything at all." Another call followed, and another. Old friends she hadn't spoken to, members of her church, her former colleagues from the hospital, people who had once only nodded politely at Laura in the grocery store now rang with words of support, their voices carrying indignation on Janet's behalf. In town, the ripple spread. At the coffee shop, Sophie overheard customers at her register murmuring about the case. "Terrible, your own daughter." They shook their heads, sliding dollar bills across the counter with sympathy in their eyes. Meanwhile, across town, Laura's world began to shrink. At her book club, whispers buzzed before she even walked in. Women she'd once dominated her certainty avoided eye contact, their smiles brittle, their questions perfunctory. When she reached for the cheese tray, hands twitched away, as if the crackers themselves had turned sour in her presence. Ethan fared no better. At the bar where he often met friends, conversations stilled when he entered. The bartender, once quick with a refill, kept his back turned longer than usual. One man muttered loud enough for others to hear, "That's the guy stealing from his own mother-in-law." Ethan's jaw tightened. He slammed his glass down harder than necessary, his fury barely. He blamed the paper, the neighbors, the judge, anyone but himself. At Ward and Associates, Rachel folded the newspaper neatly on the table, her smile subtle but sharp. "Public truth helps judicial truth," she said. "When a jury sees community support, it undermines any narrative of a bitter old woman making up stories." Janet sat across from her, posture straight, fingers tracing the headline once more. For decades, she had been quiet, the woman who let others talk over her, who kept the peace at family dinners. Now her name filled the morning paper, her story spreading farther. She closed the paper and set it aside, her voice even, almost a murmur. "Noise is protection." Sophie leaned forward, pride shining in her eyes. "They can't silence," but even as those words warmed Janet's chest, she knew this was only one battle. Headlines faded, public attention drifted, and Laura's rage was far from extinguished. Janet straightened her folder on the table, her eyes sharper than they had been in years. She would not confuse attention for victory. The war was moving to the next front, and she was ready. The courthouse steps gleamed under a pale October sun, but the air buzzed with. A cluster of reporters stood at the bottom, cameras poised, microphones bobbing like curious birds. Janet stayed inside the building, seated on a hard wooden bench in the corridor, her folder balanced on her knees. She did not need the noise outside. She had already learned what mattered. Rachel Ward arrived with crisp efficiency, a binder tucked under her arm. She sat beside Janet, smoothing the front of her suit. The grand jury has returned a decision, she said quietly. They're moving forward. Janet's grip tightened on her folder. On what charges? Fraud, exploitation, forgery. Rachel's words carried weight, but no hesitation. Both Laura and Ethan, the state prosecutor, will file indictments today. Sophie, perched on the other side of Janet, inhaled sharply. Her knuckles whitened around the strap of her backpack. For a moment, she looked like the child Janet once rocked to sleep, all soft edges and trembling breath. They're my parents, Sophie whispered, her voice thin and frayed. I love them. I do, but I can't. Her throat closed. Tears spilled hot and fast, sliding down her cheeks. Janet reached over, cupping her granddaughter's face with both hands. You don't have to stop loving them to tell the truth, she said gently. The two can live side by side. Rachel gave Sophie a small, respectful nod before rising. I'll file for restitution on your behalf as well, Janet. Not just to recover the money they stole, but to secure your rights against any future. Detective Holt entered then, her presence like a cool wind. She set a slim file on the bench beside Janet. More evidence came in this morning. Ethan tried to liquidate one of your CDs at the bank. Paper trail's ironclad. He'll have no room to maneuver. Sophie wiped her face with her sleeve, her tears slowing into sniffles. She turned toward Holt. So it's real. It's actually happening. They're going to be prosecuted? Holt's expression was steady, her voice clear. Yes, guardianship petitions are civil. But this? She tapped the file. This is criminal. The state will take it from here. The words landed like thunder, shaking the ground beneath Janet's life. The fight had shifted, no longer her against her daughter's manipulation in hushed rooms. Now, the full weight of the law pressed against Laura and Ethan. Janet inhaled slowly, straightening her back. She felt Sophie's trembling hand slip into hers, their fingers weaving tight. The doors at the far end of the hall opened, and Laura appeared with Ethan trailing behind. She wore a bright scarf, as though color could distract from the storm circling. Ethan's face was pale, his jaw tight, his movements jerky. When the prosecutor announced the indictment, the sound carried down the corridor. Reporters surged, cameras clicking, pens scribbling furious. Laura froze, her mask cracking as gasps rippled through the hall. Ethan swore under his breath, shoving past a journalist with a glare that carried more panic than anger. Janet did not rise. She sat, composed, her folder still resting on her lap, her expression one of measured. She watched her daughter's face crumble in slow motion, watched the fury and humiliation spread across features that had once only looked down on her with smug superiority. Sophie pressed closer against her grandmother, shaking with silent sobs. I don't want to hate them, she whispered into Janet's shoulder, but I can't stand what they did. Janet stroked her hair softly, steady as a heartbeat. Truth doesn't ask you to hate. It only asks you to stand. Rachel placed a reassuring hand on Janet's shoulder. We'll be ready for what comes next. The trial will move quickly now. Janet nodded, her eyes steady on the chaos unraveling across the hall. Cameras flashed, voices rose. Laura tried to speak over the but no one listened. Janet leaned close to Sophie, her whisper carrying the gravity of stone. Court doesn't need volume. It needs truth. The courtroom buzzed as Laura's attorney rose, his suit too polished, his smile too slick. He paced before the bench with practiced flair, the kind of performance designed for headlines rather than justice. Your Honor, he began, voice dripping with indignation. This entire case is not about fraud or exploitation. It's about resentment. Mrs. Miller is not a helpless victim. She is vindictive, intent on punishing her daughter for imagined slights. Laura sat beside him, chin lifted high as though his words were heard. Ethan shifted restless, his knee bouncing beneath the table, but he nodded at each accusation like a man clinging to a crumbling raft. Across the aisle, Janet sat quietly with Rachel, her folder resting on the table, hands folded neatly on top. She did not flinch, did not frown. She let the smear settle like smoke in the air, knowing Rachel would clear it with fire. Rachel rose with unhurried grace. Vindictive? She repeated, her voice calm but sharp. The evidence says otherwise. She gestured to the stack of exhibits already entered. Bank records, forged applications, intercepted Social Security payment. Not speculation, not emotion, evident. She stepped closer to the bench, her tone tightening. If Mrs. Miller were vindictive, She wouldn't have sat silent for months while her accounts were drained. She wouldn't have retrieved her phone from the trash to uncover blocked calls. She would have acted in anger, but instead, she acted in patience, in precision. Judge Collins leaned forward, adjusting his glasses. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes lingered on Rachel longer than on Laura's attorney. Detective Holt was called next. She carried a slim folder, her presence calm and authoritative. She explained the financial chain, how withdrawals tied back to Ethan's gambling, how Laura's digital fingerprints linked to fraudulent applications. Each detail dropped into the record like a brick, building a wall Laura's lawyer could not climb. When Holt finished, the room was still, the weight of evidence undeniable. Then Sophie was. The teenager walked slowly to the stand, her palms damp again. She glanced once at her. Ethan's glare was dark, Laura's smile brittle and false. Sophie swallowed hard, her throat tightening, but when she raised her right hand to swear in, her voice did not waver. Rachel's questions were gentle but precise. Sophie described the text messages, the whispers in hallways, the nights she overheard her parents plotting about getting grandma's money before she ruins it. Her voice cracked once, tears welling, but she pressed on, wiping her cheek with the back of her hand. I love them, she admitted finally, her voice trembling. But they lied. They hurt her. I can't pretend I did. The room held its breath. Even Laura's lawyer paused, his rehearsed notes suddenly flimsy in the wake of her word. Judge Collins scribbled something on his pad, his face stone. Proceed, he instructed, though his voice carried the faintest edge of impatience at the theatrics he had already endured. Rachel returned to her seat, her posture crisp. Laura's lawyer tried to salvage dignity with a closing remark about family misunderstandings blown out of proportion, but the judge barely glanced up. Janet remained still throughout, her calm presence more powerful than any raised voice in. When the gavel finally struck to adjourn for the day, she gathered her papers slowly, deliberately. Sophie slipped her hand into hers, whispering, "You didn't even have to say anything." Janet leaned toward her, her lips barely moving, her voice softer than the shuffle of papers in the courtroom. Proof doesn't need defense. The courtroom was packed, the air thick with the rustle of notebooks and the click of pens. Jurors sat in 2 neat rows, their expressions guarded but attentive, eyes following each movement at the front of the. The prosecutor stood, his presence steady, his words deliberate. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case is not about family disagreement. It is about fraud, about exploitation, about a betrayal of trust so profound it cut into the very heart of justice. He gestured toward Janet briefly, then turned to the exhibits laid neatly on the table. You will hear how Social Security payments were diverted, how signatures were forged, how accounts were drained. The defendants, Laura and Ethan Miller, preyed upon the very person they were supposed to protect. Laura shifted in her chair, lips pressed thin, while Ethan tugged nervously at his collar. When the prosecutor sat, Rachel Ward rose with her signature precision. She carried no theatric, only certainty. Your Honor, the defense would like to enter into evidence phone records retrieved from Mrs. Miller's damaged cell phone. She lifted the familiar folder, its edges now worn from weeks of handling. The clerk carried the exhibits forward. Rachel turned toward the jury. This is not speculation. These are the call logs that were deliberately blocked. This is the voicemail Mrs. Miller was never supposed to hear. The courtroom speakers played the recording. Diane's crisp, professional voice filled the room. Mrs. Miller, this is Diane from Ward & Associates. We've been trying to reach you about estate documents requiring your presence. The message ended, leaving silence hanging like a held breath. Several jurors shifted in their seats, eyes narrowing toward the defense table. Rachel's voice was calm, even. This voicemail was recovered by a technician, Mr. David Cho, who will testify as to the recovery process. David took the stand, his demeanor quiet but firm. He explained the cracked phone, the retrieval software, the extraction of records. His testimony was precise, methodical, unmarred by speculation. Nothing was fabricated, he said plainly. Everything I recovered was already there, hidden, blocked, or deleted. Laura's attorney objected once, muttering about chain of custody, but Judge Collins waved him off with visible impatience. Next came Detective Holt. She carried a timeline pinned neatly to poster board, the kind of visual that made numbers impossible. She pointed to dates and amounts, withdrawals that lined up with Ethan's gambling losses, deposits rerouted to accounts. This pattern is not consistent with error, Holt explained, her voice cool, professional. It is consistent with deliberate, repeated theft. Each word landed heavy. Jurors leaned forward, pens scratching as they took notes. Finally, She rose slowly, her steps measured, the hush in the courtroom palpable. She swore in, then settled into the witness. Rachel's questions were gentle, her tone protective. Sophie, can you tell the court what you witnessed? Sophie's hands twisted in her lap, but her voice, though quiet, carried. I saw them taking Grandma's mail. I saw them fighting about money, and they told me not to say any. Said if I did, I'd regret it. Her eyes darted toward her parents. Ethan stared at the floor. Laura's brittle smile had vanished entirely. Rachel leaned in slightly. And how did that make you feel, Sophie? The girl swallowed hard, scared, but more than that, ashamed, because I didn't stop it sooner. Her voice trembled, but she lifted her chin, finishing firmly. I won't stay quiet now. The jury's attention sharpened. A woman in the front row nodded almost imperceptibly, empathy flashing across her face. Through it all, Janet sat silent, her folder before her, her posture straight. She did not glance at Laura or Ethan, did not seek pity from the jury. Her stillness spoke louder than any witness. When the gavel struck to recess, the room erupted in murmurs. Reporters scribbled furiously. Jurors whispered to one another as they filed out, and Laura's lawyer buried his face. Janet gathered her papers slowly, calmly, her expression unreadable. Only Sophie, slipping her hand into her grandmother's as they left, heard the whisper she carried like a promise. This is only the first layer. The second day of testimony began with a stillness so taut it seemed even the fluorescent lights buzzed more softly. Jurors filed in, their notepads ready, their eyes sharper than before. Reporters shuffled in the back row, pens poised for the headline they all sensed. Rachel Ward stood at the prosecution table, a single sheet of paper in her posture controlled, but electric. Your Honor, she said, her voice resonant in the chamber. The state would like to reintroduce into evidence the voicemail recovered from Mrs. Miller's phone. This time, we will play it in full. Laura stiffened in her chair, a tremor flashing across her face like lightning. Ethan's leg bounced wildly under the table, his nerves impossible to hide. Judge Collins gave a curt nod. Proceed. Rachel pressed a small button on the player, and the courtroom filled once again with Diane's crisp, professional. Mrs. Miller, this is Diane from Ward and Associate. I'm calling to confirm, per Mr. Miller's amendment, you are the sole heir to the estate. The addendum will need your signature to finalize. Please contact us as soon as possible. The message ended, silent. Not the ordinary hush of court, but a silence that rippled with shock. Jurors exchanged wide-eyed glances. One man set his pen down slowly, as though his hand no longer trusted itself to write. A woman in the front row mouthed the words, sole heir. Rachel allowed the silence to stretch, every second tightening the noose. Then she spoke. This message was blocked from Mrs. Miller's phone. Repeated attempts to contact her were intercepted. The defendants ensured she would never know her rightful inheritance. This is not mere exploitation. It is calculated erasure. Laura's lawyer sputtered to his, objecting, insisting the voicemail was irrelevant, circumstantial, misinterpreted. His voice rose, echoing against the chamber walls, but Judge Collins cut him off with a glare. Sit down, Collins said, voice low but thunderous. Laura's composure shattered, her smile twisted into a snarl as she hissed at Ethan under her breath, eyes darting toward the jury as though she could still control their Ethan refused to look at her, his gaze fixed on the floor, shoulders caving inward. Judge Collins leaned forward, his gravelly voice carrying through every corner of the room. This case began as a guardianship petition. It is now clear it was a smokescreen for theft and fraud. The evidence is overwhelming. He paused, his gavel resting heavily. The court rules decisively against Laura and Ethan Miller. Guardianship is denied, criminal charges will proceed, and the inheritance, per the codicil, belongs solely to Janet Miller. The gavel came down with a sharp crack. Laura gasped audibly, her voice breaking into a panicked whisper. This isn't fair. This isn't... Her words were drowned by the swell of murmurs from the gallery, the journalists scribbling furiously, the jurors leaning back in their chairs with expressions that ranged from relief to disgust. At the prosecution table, Janet sat utterly still. Her glasses caught the light, her hands folded over her folder. She had not spoken a word all morning, and she did not speak now. But her silence was no longer submission, it was triumph. Beside her, Sophie broke into tears, raw and unrestrained. She threw her arms around her grandmother, burying her face into Janet's shoulder. It's over, she sobbed, the words muffled. They can't take any from you now. Janet wrapped one arm around the girl, her other hand smoothing her hair with the same gentle rhythm she had once used when Sophie was a child. Her gaze lifted, steady and unshaken, across the courtroom. She leaned close to Sophie's ear, her whisper carrying the weight of every battle, every silence endured and broken. You can't mute truth. The words cut sharper than any gavel, final as a verdict. The house was quiet again, but not the suffocating quiet it had been for months. This quiet was soft, steady, alive with the gentle hum of the refrigerator and the faint creak of the furnace warming against the chill of late October. Janet set her purse on the entryway table and took in the space as though seeing it new. The lemon polish still clung faintly to the air, but it no longer smelled like control. It smelled like hers. From the kitchen came the clatter of mugs. Sophie had claimed her old spot at the table, textbooks spread wide, a mug of cocoa steaming beside her. She looked up when Janet entered, a smile flickering across her face. "You're really home?" she said softly. Janet walked over, brushing a hand over Sophie's hair. "Yes, and so are you, it seems." Sophie grinned faintly, tugging at the sleeves of her sweatshirt. "Mom and Dad won't be. I'd rather be with you anyway." Janet pressed her lips together, emotion catching in her throat. She sat beside her granddaughter, the two of them side by side in the warm halo of the kitchen light. Later that afternoon, Rachel Ward stopped by. She carried a neat envelope, sealed and heavy with authority. She set it gently on the table before Janet. "These are the final documents. Inheritance secured, guardianship denied, restitution pending. It's all officially yours." Janet ran her fingertips across the envelope, then looked up at Rachel. "Thank you for believing me before anyone else did." Rachel's smile was small, but sure. "You gave me evidence, and you gave me resolve. You carried this case as much as I did." After Rachel left, the sun dipped low, scattering streaks of gold across the living room. Janet settled into her favorite chair, the same one where she had spent nights reading the same newspapers over and over, waiting for a phone that never rang. Sophie curled up on the sofa nearby, half asleep with her cocoa still in hand. A soft knock sounded at. Detective Holt stood there, her coat buttoned against the cold, her expression steady. "I wanted to let you know," Holt said once inside. "The sentencing hearing is scheduled. Given the evidence, both Laura and Ethan are likely facing prison time." She hesitated a moment, then added, "You did more than survive this, Mrs. Miller. You stopped it." Janet nodded slowly, her gaze drifting to Sophie sleeping soundly. "Then it was worth every step." When Holt left, Janet moved quietly upstairs to her bedroom. She opened the top drawer of her nightstand and pulled out the small bundle wrapped in a. The phone, scarred, cracked, its screen still spiderweb, lay in her pocket. For a long moment she simply stared at it. This object that had been tossed aside, buried in garbage, dismissed as useless, had carried her voice back into the world. She placed it gently into the drawer, not as evidence now, but as memory, a relic of silence broken. Downstairs, Sophie stirred and murmured, and Janet smiled softly, switching off the light. The house sank into evening calm, shadows pooling in the corners, warmth radiating from the kitchen lamp left on like a. She stood at the foot of the stairs, listening to the hush, the kind of quiet that no longer pressed down on her, but wrapped her instead. Her whisper floated into the stillness, steady and certain. "My line is open again." The community center smelled faintly of brewed coffee and autumn leaves carried in on. Rows of folding chairs filled the hall, every seat. Seniors with canes, widows with neat purses clasped in their laps, a few younger faces lingering in the back. They had come to hear Janet Miller. She stood at the podium, not in a courtroom this time, not under threat or accusation. Today, she stood as herself. Her voice was steady, though quiet. "When my daughter threw away my phone, she thought she was cutting off my. She thought silence would keep me still. But the truth is, our voices matter most when someone tries hardest to bury them." Murmurs of agreement moved through the crowd. Heads nodded. A woman in the front row dabbed her eyes with a tissue. Janet gestured to the pamphlets on the table nearby. "Protecting Your Communication, a guide for seniors." Pages she had helped draft with Rachel and Detective Holt, ensuring others would know how to safeguard their calls, their mail, their finance. "This isn't just about my story," Janet her gaze sweeping across the audience. "It's about making sure yours can't be stolen. Your benefits, your property, your peace, they are yours, and no one else's." Applause swelled. Not thunderous but warm, like a wave lifting her higher. From her seat near the front, Sophie clapped hardest, her cheeks flushed with pride. She had insisted on coming, notebook in hand, ready to capture every moment. When Janet's eyes found her, Sophie grinned wide, her expression radiant with a pride that had nothing to do with grades or college plans, and everything to do with courage. Rachel Ward stood off to the side, arms crossed, her expression softer. She inclined her head once, a gesture of approval that needed no word. Detective Holt lingered at the back, leaning against the wall. She too nodded slightly, her calm presence a reminder that justice didn't end in one courtroom. It spread, case by case, voice by voice. After the event, people lined up to shake Janet's hand. Some whispered gratitude, some shared their own fears about children or relatives who had grown too controlling. Janet listened to each, her hands warm, her eyes unwavering. She wasn't a victim in their gaze, she was proof of survival. When the crowd thinned, Sophie slipped her arm through Janet's. "Grandma, you were amazing," she said breathlessly. "You made them all believe, just like you made me believe." Janet smiled softly, her hand resting over Sophie. "I didn't make anyone believe. I just told the truth. That's all I ever had." They walked together toward the exit, the late afternoon light spilling through the glass doors. Outside, the world seemed brighter, crisp leaves swirling, voices carrying from the park across the street, life moving forward. At the car, Rachel approached with a small box. "Thought you might want this," she said, handing it over. Inside were copies of every court document neatly bound, the official record of what had been done and undone. Janet held it close, but she didn't feel the weight as a burden anymore. It was history, and it was hers. That evening, back home, the house was filled with warmth, lamps glowing, Sophie's laughter echoing from the kitchen as she baked cookies, music playing low from the radio. Janet sat in her chair, the final document stacked neatly on. She no longer needed to keep the folder in her lap like armor. She watched Sophie dance clumsily to the radio, her apron dusted with flour. For the first time in years, Janet felt not just relief, but legacy. The fight had not ended her. It had carved a path for others, for Sophie, for every senior who might one day find their voice threatened. She leaned back, the hum of the house wrapping her in. Her whisper carried through the quiet, not to anyone in particular, but to the world that had finally heard her. Voices matter. And in the deepest corner of her heart, she added the words she had carried since the day she pulled her phone from the trash, words now final, irrevocable, victorious. And when the call came through, it didn't just save me, it ended them.